People have actually looked at the connection between the prefrontal cortex, which is part of, making sure we have executive function, we're rational, we're doing things stepwise, working memory, etc. All prefrontal cortex, and the connection to the amygdala, which is the emotional centers of our brain. And when we are well rested, that connection is much tighter and we're doing much better. But when we get sleep deprived, that connection naturally starts to wither away, and we can feel it, right? We're much more likely, as you mentioned, to be triggered quickly. We're really quick to snap. And it's all because our brains have no way of actually dealing with sleep deprivation.
It's a brand new day. Hey. Wake up every morning and say, it's a brand new day. Hey. Take a good day, make it great. Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Whole Parent Podcast. I am so excited that you've chosen to be with us today because we are talking all about sleep. We're talking about sleep training. We're talking about good sleep hygiene. We are talking about night lights and sound machines and all of the questions that you all have about sleep. That is what we are going to be digging into today. And it's not just going to be me. For the first time ever on the Whole Parent Podcast, I am going to be hosting a guest. In this case, it is Dr. Sujay Kansagra from Duke. He is a leading expert in the field of pediatric sleep research and pediatric neurology. He is a doctor. He knows all of the things about sleep, and he happens to align very closely with how I view sleep. And so I was super excited to bring him on the podcast, and I cannot wait for you guys to sink your teeth into, to dig into that episode, and for you to learn have your questions answered and feel much better, much more confident in raising resilient kids and well-rested kids, because as he points out during this episode, it is so important. Sleep is massively important, not only for our kids, but also for us. So I want to get into that episode, but before I turn it over to myself in interview form, I want to do one quick thing, and that's to remind you that if you have not yet rated and reviewed this podcast, to please go and do that. Do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you're listening to this right now. Before we get into the episode, I'm not going to stop the episode in the middle to give you this call to action like I normally do. I don't usually say this at the beginning. We just dive right in, but I'm going to say it right now because the stuff we're talking about, it's so riveting. I don't want to take time away from that to say it. So I'll be back to remind you to do this at the end of the episode, and especially to share this with a friend who has a child who is struggling with sleep. Without further ado, it's time for us to meet Dr. Sujay on the Whole Parent Podcast. All right, I am excited to welcome my first guest of the podcast ever. It is Dr. Sujay Kansagra from Duke. Dr. Kansagra, introduce yourself. Who are you?
Yeah, John, first of all, I'm honored to be the first guest. So I am a child neurologist and a sleep medicine physician at Duke. I've been on faculty for, about 12 years now. And so day in and day out, I'm seeing children that have difficulty with sleep. That's my life. That's
your life. So right. Those of us parents who have children who have difficulty with sleep, you deal with us all the time. So this is no sweat to you.
That's right. This really, sleep is my life. And so when it comes to research, when it comes to seeing patients that have challenges, I'm all about it. So yes, You've come to the right place for sleep advice.
I've come to the right place. So you actually don't know this about me, but my father-in-law was actually at one point one of the leading sleep apnea researchers.
Get out of town.
Dave Carley. So he was developed. So I know as much about sleep as I could possibly retain to try and seem interesting to him when I was courting his daughter. So that's about about my baseline of sleep is I was really, really trying to make a good impression. And so I learned as much as I could to make it seem like I knew what I was talking about. I'm sure.
Wonderful.
But we were high school sweethearts, so the bar was pretty low. Yeah, so we're talking about sleep today. We've already done a Whole Parent episode on a podcast episode on sleep, getting your kids to go to sleep. But you are the expert on here, and so usually the way that this podcast works is for those who might be listening for the first time. Maybe this is your first episode. I usually am doing this solo, and I answer 3 questions that I get from the community. And so the really fun part of having an awesome research guest, a guest who really is an expert in the field, is that I get to ask the questions that I have, and I also get to learn the ways in which I have been messing up. So Sujay, you said that you've been following me, and you said that like most of the stuff I say on sleep is not totally off the wall, right?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, one of your recent posts on helping your toddler go to sleep was really good, and you actually hit on a technique that we use frequently to help children, particularly if they have some baseline anxiety regarding sleep. So I'm happy to chat about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. The frequent check-ins. Yeah, and I've
That's
actually
right.
mentioned
Yeah.
I mentioned that I maybe on the anxiety episode as well that I did last. But so that's a helpful tool. But what about some other sleep tips? So if you had to give me, in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, however long you want to go, the best sleep tips for parents of infants and toddlers, where would you start with that?
Gosh, yes. There's so much changes during those first few years of life. So I'll tell you that the core foundation for good sleep, we call it sleep hygiene. People have heard of dental hygiene and personal hygiene. Sleep hygiene is essentially the things in your environment and your behaviors that can help or hurt your sleep. And so I always start there. And there are really kind of 4 core pillars when it comes to sleep hygiene. First, it's having a great nighttime routine. A routine is important for every human being, including infants and toddlers, particularly. Having 20 minutes before bed, 3 or 4 calm, relaxing activities that you do in the same way every single night. Super helpful. Second thing is avoiding things that we know will disrupt sleep. And so, for that age group, it's usually bright lights. And so electronic use starts very early. We know that our children are really tied in with screens these days because they're everywhere, but you really want to avoid screen time for those 30 minutes prior to bed. Keep the lights a little bit dim, very helpful. Interestingly, when it comes to like caffeine, you wouldn't think I'd have to talk about that for the toddler years, but there are toddlers that start having caffeine exposure very early. So I'll mention that as well. No child should have any caffeine. So that's all part of step 2, avoiding things that can perhaps worsen your sleep.
Yeah. And third, that just goes all the time, right? Like no toddler should have caffeine ever.
ever. Yeah. If it was up to me, none of us would ever have caffeine ever. But, at least ideally, even through adolescence, you want to try to limit the amount of caffeine that you have.
Okay.
The third thing to keep in mind is a comfortable, calm environment. So of course, making sure it's not too noisy, it's dark. Cool tends to be best. So we usually say 68 to 72 degrees, but every child is a little bit different. And then fourth is keeping your schedule the same on the weekdays and the weekends, trying to keep things as consistent as possible. Those are the cores of good sleep hygiene.
Awesome. And things like, the things that I get asked about all the time are things like, what do you think? What do you feel about nightlights, sound machines, those kind of sleep aids for toddlers and kids?
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a purist. And so in that sense, if a child is otherwise healthy and doesn't have any other medical disorders that could be disrupting sleep, my goal is always to try to get a child to sleep as independently as possible. Yet, if they do need some extra help, certainly when it comes to white noise machines or sound machines in the background, if you're keeping them at an appropriate level when it comes to sound, and for children, we try to aim as low as possible, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't have a lot of data that says it's going to be harmful long-term, et cetera, as long as the noise level is appropriate. My goal is that if you expose them to something at the start of the night to help them transition to sleep, it's ideal that same stimulus is in place throughout the entire night. And with white noise machines, you can do that. You can kind of keep it on throughout the night. But again, as long as it's far away from the crib or from their bed, and it's not too loud.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of parents, the white noise, that's a good note on keeping it. I have a follow-up question to that because actually one of the pieces of advice kind of goes directly against that. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts. But one of the things that with sound machines that I hear parents say a lot is it's not even so much to help them go to sleep. It's more like, I have other kids. What do I do during nap time? My other kids are going to make noise. Can I have some sort of aid to make the environment seem less chaotic for my baby?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very helpful in that sense for sure. It helps to drown out background noise, et cetera. The tricky part about this is that, the white noise machines, we don't want them to be around forever for the kids. And we know there's going to be some level of kind of noise in the environment, et cetera, throughout their lives. And so we want to be a little bit careful in how we use it. And then if you're traveling, you may not have access to, the white noise all the time. And so it can become a little bit of a dependency. But again, if it's something that you can take with you on trips, if it's something that your child has gotten accustomed to and enjoys, no problem.
Yeah. Well, and that's the real challenge, right? Is the balancing being as consistent as possible. And I think my follow-up question to this, so the thing I was going to mention is night lights. So I've been a big advocate for like as dark as possible. And this is just seems to be, because it's in so many cases throughout the night, their room is going to be really dark. So trying to transition away from a nightlight, one of the things that I would mention to parents is you can have a nightlight on a timer that is on when the kid is falling asleep, but then goes off. What would be your thoughts on that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, my approach for nightlights is, if it works for your child, totally fine. I wouldn't introduce it unless you feel like there is some need and your child is actually requesting it as a toddler. Because you're right, ideally having things as dark as possible. Now, night lights are usually not bright enough such that they're going to bother you when it comes to melatonin secretion. The amount of lux that they put out is pretty low, so you're not going to have an issue there. But, child wakes up, you're a little bit more stimulated in your environment because you can see what's going on. The night light might be creating shadows that bother them, et cetera. And so, use it if you truly feel like it's going to help your child, but by no means should it be a necessary thing if your child is doing well without it. Now, the tricky thing about having something there during the transition to sleep is that every child is going to wake up. And this is something that I'm always emphasizing to parents. I tell them they're going to wake up multiple times at night. The awakenings are totally normal. We do that when we go through sleep cycles, the ups and downs. And so the awakening is no problem. If something is really different when they wake up at nighttime than when they first fell asleep, it might end up leading to more challenges falling back asleep. So that can include almost anything. It can include music that you're playing during the transition to sleep. For adults, it's like having the TV on, right? We all know that adult that says, I have to have the TV on to fall asleep. Yep. They've become a little bit dependent on that. So when they wake up at night, it can be hard to fall asleep. And for infants, notoriously, it's caregivers that get in this rigmarole of saying, okay, my child has to be rocked to sleep. And then every time they wake up at night, they have to be rocked again to fall asleep. So ideally keeping the environment consistent at the time they fall asleep, the same as when they wake up throughout the night. Hopefully the environment will be the same for them.
Yeah. Just on that note, one of the pieces so we're really, really big on sleep in our house, and just, I think I get the least amount of sleep of everyone in our house, to be honest, but I also have the easiest time going to sleep of anyone in our house. So it's kind of, I wind up being the nighttime caretaker often. But when I think about all of the things that we've been doing, so we have a 7-year-old who really had a lot of struggles, and he's the one who, and oftentimes the nightlight thing that has come up with him, he's requested one, or the check-ins, that's a big one for him. I have a 7-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old, and my 3-year-old and 2-year-old, we have gotten we've helped them to become significantly less dependent on us kind of as we've gone. So my 3-year-old basically needed to be rocked to sleep until he was like 3, which is huge. We did this with a yoga ball so that it wasn't so horrible on our back. But you can imagine like me going through the airport, right? So like
Absolutely.
I have in my airport bag, like 1/3 of the things in my bag are things related to my kids' sleep. So we have like the monitors, we have the sound machines, we have the yoga ball deflated, we have a pump for the yoga ball to pump it up. We have and then all the other things, we have the blackout curtain. We use this company Sleepaway that you can put like little suction cups on the window, and they make great products, but it does create this dependence where it's like, man, I have to almost have a dedicated carry-on so that my kids will sleep, which seems crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, you certainly put a lot of time and effort into it, and I mean, it's great to make sleep a priority, And I kind of in my mind, I want to tell you when it comes to gentle parenting approaches, like sleep should be a core pillar of gentle parenting, because It's so much easier to be a gentle parent when everybody is sleeping well, particularly the parent.
Man, you are preaching to the choir here. Yeah, this is actually a big part of. This is actually why I tend to separate myself away from like but many gentle parenting creators, is because they often don't prioritize things like sleep, where it's like, man, if you're triggered at your kid, like number one, it's either because they're being intolerable because they haven't slept well, or you have no frustration tolerance because you haven't. And
that's right. Man, yeah.
So
Can I give you a little bit of nerdy science with this? Please. People have actually looked at the connection between the prefrontal cortex, which is part of, making sure we have executive function, we're rational, we're doing things stepwise, working memory, et cetera, all prefrontal cortex, and the connection to the amygdala, which is the emotional centers of our brain. And when we are well rested, that connection is much tighter and we're doing much better. But when we get sleep deprived, that connection naturally starts to wither away, and we can feel it, right? We're much more likely, as you mentioned, to be triggered quickly. We're really quick to snap. And it's all because our brains have no way of actually dealing with sleep deprivation. no species on the planet voluntarily sleep deprives itself except for humans. And we have no coping mechanisms of sleep deprivation. I joke that our soul begins to erode when we're sleep deprived. We just can't handle it. And our temperament and our ability to cope with stress definitely is affected with sleep deprivation. But there's some real science to back that up, why it is so challenging.
Well, and with kids, especially, I mean, you know this better than anyone, but just for our listeners, when your prefrontal cortex is so underdeveloped as a child, you need that connection and those neural synapses to be really tight, because they can't just will their way through, overpowering the amygdala hijack. Like they require that level of co-regulation because they don't have an ability to just power through like many adults do. But that is what adults are doing when, by the way, right? We're powering through. Like we're not living our best life when we're sleep deprived either.
100%. So there are so many things that falter when you're sleep deprived, including just your day-to-day mood, your energy level, et cetera. So your quality of life definitely suffers. But we know it actually impacts just about every medical condition and psychiatric condition you can think of. When you have bad sleep, everything seems to suffer. And so yes, I'm convinced that most of us are going through life and experiencing consciousness in the semi-fog due to lack of sleep. And one of my core missions is to help people live their best consciousness experience, which includes getting the rest that you need.
Yeah, I don't know where I heard this. There's another podcast, and I wish I had the citation here, but it was kind of like one of these, alpha male podcasts, probably. I think I saw it on TikTok or something, but the guy was saying the percentage of the population, I'm going to try and say this exactly right, the percentage of the population that can function on less than 6 hours of sleep with no impairment, rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent, is zero.
Zero. That's right. 0%. Correct. Yeah. People like to think that we can become short sleepers. People like to think you can train yourself to get less sleep. People like to come up with these biohacks and say, oh, now I'm doing polyphasic sleep, or I'm cold plunging to decrease my sleep. I mean, there's all sorts of this, lunacy out there. It turns out based on the best studies that we have, there's actually no way to get accustomed to sleeping less. And in fact, the objective measures of how well you're performing cognitively, they do this test called the psychomotor vigilance task, where have you try to focus for a long period of time. Your performance declines in a fairly linear fashion the longer you're sleep deprived. And it's actually dose dependent. Like the less sleep you're getting, the worse you do over time. But interestingly, your subjective experience of how sleep deprived you are, that does eventually plateau. So you think, you know what, I'm doing okay. I'm not that sleep deprived, yet our brain function, our cognitive abilities continue to worsen, which is a really kind of a scary combination.
Well, it is, especially when you watch TV shows like Grey's Anatomy and you learn that most of your doctors are sleeping like 1 hour a night.
It's bonkers. It's bonkers what we allow physicians to do. It's actually really interesting because I ended up getting a lot of questions from pilots saying, hey, how do I deal with my jet lag? And I'm like, do you not have courses on this? Does the FAA not mandate that you have to have them, know how to deal with these types of things? You're flying planes, And so it's pretty bonkers. I think and part of this is also just historically and culturally, we kind of wear sleep deprivation as a badge of honor. We're like, oh, look, I didn't sleep very much. And we should do the opposite. We should be shaming people that aren't sleeping very well. It's a problem. You're not at your best self when you're sleep deprived.
No. Well, you're not at your best performance, but you're also not at your best, as you kind of really put it super well. You're not at your best cognitive and even like contemplative state. Right. Like
that's right.
If you're totally, I remember getting a master's degree and when you're in that process and you're staying up all night because you like have a full-time job and a young kid and you're in school and you're pulling all nighters, man, I was not happy. Like I thought that I was happy, but in reality, really not. And so let's just transition really quickly to, before we get into some sleep fallacies, because I want to hear this. I want you to spill the tea on all of the sleep fallacies out there. But before we get to that, I just want to hit. We've already kind of talked about toddlers, and we've talked a lot about adults, newborns. So newborns are in a completely different sleep category, and then newborn parents, parents of newborn, so sleep deprived as a population.
Yes.
What are our keys for survival? Not even success, but survival.
Yeah. It is. So sleep as a newborn, especially from 0 to 6 weeks of age, it's a complete crap show when it comes to sleep, And the reason is because children don't really have any semblance of a circadian rhythm. And so people always say, oh, the kids' schedules flip flop and they think day is night, night is day. Well, turns out they don't know what day and night even is at that point. And so and they're feeding really frequently. Their stomachs are really small and they're working on getting bigger and bigger feeds over time, but they're kind of in demand all the time of eating and waking at random times. So it is a challenge. Now, I wish I could just say, well, rely on your village, but unfortunately, oftentimes we don't have a village around us anymore, right? I mean, we are really a small group that's helping take care of a child. So, first and foremost, I say, especially for moms, which they do unfairly take the brunt during this time, I say, please rely on your pediatrician or your OB if you have any concern about postpartum depression. It is incredibly common. And there are lots of things that we can do to help. Second, I would say is I just make sure people understand, the social media world when it comes to parenting is not real. And so when you see Sally Fitness at 2 weeks postpartum showing off her six pack and hiking through the Amazon rainforest with her baby on her back, that's not real. And so we have to stop comparing ourselves with things that aren't real. Now, practical things that you can do. One, go ahead and try to actually start a routine very early. That's not for your baby. Your baby is really not going to care. But it's actually good for you to have something that if you're doing the same way every single day consistently, it adds a little bit of control to the chaos, something that's in your control. Second, I would say when it comes to breastfeeding, if you are breastfeeding, particularly if you're pumping breast milk, interestingly, your breast milk does have melatonin in it. And so if you're pumping nighttime milk, I actually recommend trying to label it and trying to give that to your baby at nighttime because that can actually help them sleep. So a real kind of practical thing that you can do. And then know that there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic because as 6 weeks starts rolling around, more of that baby sleep is going to be at nighttime. And hopefully you're going to start getting more sleep yourself because their sleep is getting more consolidated. So that's kind of my approach. But hang in there. It does get easier, but those first 6 weeks are just rough for everyone.
Yeah. On the podcast, we say embrace the suck. Like it's just going to suck.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And understand that is so normal. That is so normal that it's going to be really rough,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and that's such helpful advice, especially like you said for moms. I've never heard the breast milk thing. I know that breast milk has melatonin, but that breast milk that is pumped at different times of the day has different amounts based on your circadian rhythm. I mean, that's right. It kind of goes right in line with the I'm trying to remember what it's called, but the skin to skin thing where your temperature fluctuates up and down in comparison to your baby, right? Like that's similar. Your body is actually trying to kind of grab their body and pull them into alignment.
Well, it's interesting because when the baby's in utero, your melatonin is the baby's melatonin. And so moms do see that tends to start lining up, that usually the baby's is calm for a good chunk, hopefully a good chunk of the night. It varies, of course, but it helps the baby get in that pattern. But then once they're out in the world and they're not making their own melatonin, that's when things start getting crazy. So yes, the breast milk can definitely help. Now, don't go crazy over this, moms. You have a lot on your plate during those first few weeks. And if you can't do it, it's not the end of the world for sure. But again, if it's something that you're able to easily label, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're putting the date on it anyway, just slap a time on it too.
Yeah. AM or PM, that's right.
Provided that you actually know what time it is, which
that's right. We're making a lot of assumptions here. That's right. You got to know what time it is. Yeah. Yeah.
My rule for newbornhood, and I didn't, we did an episode on welcoming a new baby to the family, but it was much more about the older kids. But if I was going to, I'll do an episode on my tips for bringing a newborn home. And this episode, I'm sure is going to inform a lot of that. But one of my tips is with the embracing the suck is just like resign yourself to ordering DoorDash or whatever, you're going to get. Like, that's all you're going to, like, you're not going to eat well, like you're going to eat. And that's something. Like, put up the weird dark curtains on your window so you can't like get up and like try and do the day. But as much, if you have to just like sleep from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. because that's when you can, it's way better to do that because, like you said, it's temporary. And this is not a.
It's right. It's all about getting through and being practical. That's right. Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So I also want to make sure that we spend time, a little bit of time to talk about sleep training and cry it out. But before we do that, what are some sleep fallacies that you see other than, my baby sleeps through the night at 2 months old, which that's the one that drives me the most nuts, to be honest, because the stomach, the newborn feedings at 2 months old, just not enough to get 12 hours of sleep. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you that one of the big things is, let's talk about some fallacies. One is sleep regressions. People always say there are going to be sleep regressions at certain months of age, and then we're just doomed to experience them. The data doesn't really bear that out. This was based on some old science that we don't think is held true. At any given month during the first year of life, about 30% of children are probably going to experience some type of regression almost every single month, and don't consider it a setback. Try to stay consistent, try to push through it. Don't start making huge changes if what you're doing before was working. Lots of things are changing with your child when it comes to development, et cetera. Try to maintain consistency and push through. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to light exposure, a lot of people are like, oh, I got to get my baby out in the sun, et cetera, during the daytime. And I say, well, yes, light can be helpful, but trust me when I say that day versus night, when it comes to your eyes, is fairly easy to understand, even if you're indoors, because it's so bright during the day. Nothing beats the power of the sun when it comes to brightness in your home, even. And so you don't have to go to extra lengths to get your baby out there and getting tons of light. And you want to protect that, delicate skin when they're young and avoid direct exposure. And so don't feel pressured that you have to go, taking your baby out into the sun every single day. I'd love to jump into some of the myths regarding sleep training, because there's so much around that.
Sure.
It's a lot to unpack.
One of the things you said about sleep regressions, this is something that I've experienced too. And we're both recording with natural light right now at about 5 p.m. So there's plenty of natural light in your home, right? But one of the things I just wanted to say about sleep regressions is this is something that I kind of experienced anecdotally now with the third child. I think those of us who have multiple kids, you realize that if you Google 3-month sleep regression, there will be 10 articles. If you Google 4-month sleep regression, there will be 10 articles. If you Google any month sleep regression. John,
I just had a 512-month sleep regression recently. It was personally, it was short-lived and we pushed through it, right? These things happen. Sleep is not linear. Sleep is a winding course, but hopefully the trajectory is in an upward direction. But know that it's not linear, and that's okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. So with that said, let's really dive in here on sleep training. I have strong feelings about sleep training, namely that I have not sleep trained any of my kids, but I also appreciate that we live in the United States in a country that does not have adequate resources for parents, namely affordable childcare. We don't, as you mentioned before, culturally, we don't have any sort of village mindset. From a work perspective, we're elevating people through the ranks who are chronically sleep deprived because they're doing so intentionally. We don't have paid paternal leave. We don't have anywhere near as much paid maternal leave as we need. So with all those things being said, sleep training may be, I don't want to demonize anybody who felt that they had to sleep train their child in order to sleep themselves. However, I also see the pendulum swing back the other way, where if you don't sleep train your kid, now you're seen as the one I saw a video not that long ago. Why you're abusive if you're not sleep training.
So, oh, wow. Yeah.
So tell us, it's some random creator, right?
Let me tell you. Yeah. Let me tell you my personal views as a father, a child neurologist, and a sleep physician. And then we can delve into some like the hard data and the science behind it.
Sure.
First, my personal view is that sleep training, based on everything that we know, is an option. It's an option for families. No one should ever tell you you have to sleep train. No one should ever do that. It's a personal parenting choice, and you decide what's best for you. On the flip side, no one should ever say you should not sleep train based on misinformation, to say that it's going to be harmful to your child or you're being a terrible parent, et cetera. No one should demonize you out of sleep training. So at the end of the day, it's a choice. It's a safe and effective option for those that choose to use it. And for families that want to do something to help their child sleep, I hope they don't get swayed by that misinformation of people telling them that they can't because it's harmful and you're going to hurt your child, et cetera. So that's my 10,000 foot view on it.
Sure.
Happy to dive into the data, but the other thing that I'll tell you is there are options here. There are lots of options, and we use the word sleep training. But in medicine, it's behavioral insomnia of childhood. These are behavioral interventions to help with behavioral insomnia of childhood. And the core here is we're trying to teach children to become self-soothers, be able to fall asleep independently, such that when they do have those awakenings we talked about, those normal awakenings, they look around, everything is the same as when they first fell asleep, and they're able to transition back to sleep on their own.
Sure.
There are lots of different techniques, but I'll tell you that the cry it out technique, aka the extinction approach, it's kind of fallen out of favor with everybody, to be honest. People don't really like the extinction approach for many reasons. There is data to support safety and efficacy, and that's all great. But nobody really feels good about just saying, okay, just let your child cry it out without any sort of intervention, without any sort of soothing. And so, yes, that technique is there in certain situations. If the family is in crisis mode and we need to make some changes super fast, yes, that can be an option for some, but it doesn't tend to be the go-to for sleep medicine physicians and for most of the sleep consultants out there in the world. So I'll start with that.
Yeah. And I think the thing with extinction method or even like, I think radical Ferber, am I saying Ferber method approach?
Ferber, yeah.
So people who take that to an extreme too, it can feel that way where it almost becomes an extinction approach at some point. The thing that strikes me with that is, if you are having violent ideations against your child because of postpartum depression or sleep deprivation or whatever, like extinction is so much preferable to you holding a child that you are at risk of harming, period.
100%. So let's talk a bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we dive into that? Because that's huge.
Before I go on, let's go into that.
And feelings of being overwhelmed due to lack of sleep are very real. And I will tell you that in my experience, many terrible things that happen to children are due to fatigue from the caregiver. Okay.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that, I've even had, I've had pediatricians. I've had pediatricians tell me that I was so sleep deprived that, one night my child was in the middle of the night crying and I walked up to my child and I'm like, someone please take my child right now because I'm not in a safe space, and for a pediatrician to say that when they have all the resources and help and then, and they had another caregiver in the house, I think that's very telling. So yes, these techniques, particularly if you're feeling overwhelmed and sleep is just not working for you, please think about these because they can really help. And I get tons of comments from moms saying it was literally like a lifesaver for me. Like I was so far at the end of my rope when it came to fatigue and exhaustion that sleep training was a lifesaver. And I believe it. In many cases, I think it's a lifesaver.
Well, and then you have on the other side, right? Like all that being true and all that, this is the delicate dance of social media. Both of us are on social media. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram, where your videos are limited to a minute or, maybe 2 minutes. And it's hard to get into these kind of deep, nuanced conversations. So we can say all of that is true and is necessary and we have to destigmatize for the parents for whom, you think about the horror stories of a parent who's so sleep deprived, but they feel so much internal shame about sleep training that they won't take the steps that they need to do to stay safe. And then the result is their child is hurt, kind of inexcusably or inexplicably hurt in ways beyond what any damage that sleep training ever could have done, And so you think about that and you go, absolutely. Right. And then on the other side, you have the parents who feel like if I don't sleep train, I'm a bad parent. And those parents, as you kind of said, the extinction method is widely going out of fashion, primarily because I've seen crippling mental health concerns, be acted out by women who feel that they can't go into the room with their child or a dad who can't go into the room. And they're like every hormone in my body is telling me to go pick this child up. And I'm being told that would make me a bad parent. And so that creates the other end of the spectrum of if it's causing your mental health to deteriorate and your attachment to your child, not that their attachment to you necessarily will be affected, but if it's causing the deterioration of your attachment to your child, then maybe you should rethink the method of sleep training that you are.
Great. Such great points. So John, let's dive into, the data that we have regarding the consequences of sleep deprivation, because there's so much information out there, particularly when it comes to benefit versus harm, this risk benefit kind of analysis here, right? And it's interesting because the debate, there's a hot debate in the social media world amongst the data and amongst, sleep physicians and pediatricians. There's no debate. I mean, there's zero debate. And that's because the data that we have shows that in the short and medium term, sleep training has a multitude of benefits when it comes to sleep continuity, when it comes to parental perception of sleep, when it comes to maternal depression scores, when it comes to even things like attachment to your child, marital satisfaction, all those things actually seem to improve with sleep training. Sometimes the opposite of what people will say. They say, oh, that's going to hurt your attachment. The data shows the opposite. It actually shows it could improve. But the interesting thing is when it comes to long-term outcomes regarding sleep, if you look 5 years down the road, it's all kind of a wash. Everybody's kind of sleeping pretty much the same. You can't really distinguish a sleep trained group versus a non-sleep trained group. So if the family that's like, I really don't want to sleep train, am I destined for just terrible sleep? Well, no, the data doesn't say that. The data says that your child may eventually just start sleeping just as well as any child that was sleep trained. We don't know how long that might be, but they might do fine. So long-term, it's kind of a wash. Now, when it comes to harm, there have been many studies that have looked at short-term, but studies that have also looked 5 years out, looking at mental health, looking at attachment, looking at behavioral, all these different metrics when it comes to psychosocial analysis of the child, sleep metrics, et cetera. And there's no difference there either, when it comes to anxiety levels or depression scores, et cetera. So we have to take the notion that this is somehow going to cause harm to the child and say, well, the data does not bear that out. Now, when it comes to the parent's own kind of well-being, I know that the sleep training can be very emotionally taxing. Again, it's parent choice. It's your choice regarding what you want to do. And just know that when it comes to methods, nobody should also tell you, oh, there's one way to do it, and this is the only right way. Because the data tells us there are 4 methods that actually have data to support them. And even within those methods, there are various things you can do to ensure that it's lining up with your own needs and your own expectations for what you want to do as a parent, and and your desires for how you want to interact with your child during sleep training. Yeah. And I can just give you one example here, if I can delve into the Ferber technique, for example.
Sure.
The Ferber technique is this technique of intermittent checks, right? Where you do your nighttime routine, you do all the fun stuff you do with your child, all the hugs, all the kisses. We're not here to take away, all the fun and love that you have for your child. But once that's done, you put them in their safe sleep space, which is typically the crib, and then you wait. And most children that have developed a bit of a dependency on a caregiver to sleep, they'll usually start fussing and crying at this point. So what you do is you have a time. You say, okay, in 5 minutes, I'm gonna step away and I'm gonna check in at 5 minutes and actually go to my child and soothe them, let them know that I'm still here, soothe them for a minute, not take them out of the crib, and then you wait. And then you wait another specified period of time. Maybe you wait 10 minutes. And then you wait every 15 minutes, for example, but you intermittently check. That timing is totally arbitrary, So if a parent is like, I'm not going to wait 5 minutes, feels like internal amount of time for me. I say, okay, let's check it 2 minutes, and let's check every 2 minutes. And the parent says, well, I don't want to leave the room. I don't want my child to feel abandoned. And I say, well, don't leave the room, sit right there in the room with the child in the corner and just wait these times and be reading a book so your child knows you're still there. You haven't left. So there are lots of ways that you can modify what you do to ensure that you aren't feeling like you've abandoned your child or you're hurting your child anyway, all based on parental preference.
Well, and I think that that's so profound just to destigmatize that, right? Because as you're talking, I can feel my sense of, as this parent who's always gone to their child as soon as they cry, I can feel this anxiety. But then what you just described is exactly what we did, which is no, but I was in the room or I went and sat in this chair. And then when my son was, kind of at an age where we could explain to him, no, I'm going to leave now, but I'm going to continue to come back. It's just, I'm going to do the checks from not in the room, And so it's really what you're describing is I think probably what a lot of parents do. And they feel like this isn't sleep training, but what you're telling me right now is that is sleep training.
The core of sleep training is essentially helping your child learn some of those self-soothing mechanisms. How do I turn my brain from on to off? And at some point, children, we all learn this skill at some point. Everybody learns to fall asleep, but we think that children can develop that skill fairly early. And some as early as 4 months, but usually we're waiting till around 6 months for children. But somewhere between 4 and 6 months, that skill can actually be taught. And so it's really, giving them that skill of self-soothing, that I can turn my brain off, and then I can do it again when I wake up at night and I look around and I'm like, oh yeah, everything looks about the same. I'm still tired. I'm going to go back to sleep. That's the core of sleep training.
Sure. And so to those parents who are, I don't know what the word would be for it, but very attachment. I don't like saying attachment parents because it makes it sound like if you don't do this, then you're not an attached parent. But those parents who are more the way that my wife and I were, where, we go to our kids every time. What advice would you have for us? Because I know there's so much advice out there for the parents who are more traditional in the sleep training approaches from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. What about those of us who just cannot stay away? What can we do to foster good sleep hygiene and health for our kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are other methods, so I talked about the Ferber or the graduate extinction method. There are other methods that are conducive to that very style. And that one is called camping out. Camping out is where you make some really slow, gradual changes at the time of transition from wake to sleep, and such that you don't have to have any prolonged periods of crying, et cetera, that you're always there essentially. And so how does that look? Well, if you're constantly having to rock your child to sleep, for example, you're like, oh, I got to rock them and they won't fall asleep without it. I say, okay, this week, what we're going to do is you're gonna hold them, but you're just gonna rock a little bit back and forth this week until they fall asleep. And when they wake up at night, you're gonna go right to them. You're not gonna let them cry. You're gonna get them out. And you're just gonna rock them a little bit until they fall asleep. It's not gonna be as vigorous as you're doing before. They might have a little bit harder time, but you're right there. You're with them. You're helping them transition. Next week, instead of rocking, you're just gonna hold them until they fall asleep. And we're not going to rock. You're just going to hold them. And when they wake up, you go right to them and we're just going to hold them. The week after that, we're going to put them in the crib while they're still drowsy, but still awake. And we're going to pat them until they fall asleep. So you're right there. You're not leaving them. Each of these transitions maybe met with a little bit of fussing, but you're right there as a parent and you're not leaving them, on their own. Eventually the goal is, you go from patting to just sitting next to the crib until they fall asleep, and then sitting a few feet away from the crib until they fall asleep, then sitting 6 feet away, then sitting right outside the door, but still within line of sight, and then eventually completely out the door. So it's a slow, gradual weaning of parental presence that hopefully is, still allows you to have that time to respond to your child and not feel like you're leaving them to cry for long periods of time.
Well, and it builds confidence as much in the child as in the parent too, right? So
right.
In both of those cases, you have, I like to say that you have two brains that you're working with. A lot of parents think that I can just I'll just do whatever my kid needs. I'm just not going to matter to me. I'll just do whatever's the right thing to do. No, you won't. You'll do the Venn diagram of what works for you and works for your child. You're not going to do, what I mean? And all of us will do that. Maybe that Venn diagram has, wow, I'm really willing to, kind of go out of my comfort zone to an extent more than maybe my partner is or whatever, but that's all comparing, and don't compare, right? It's always going to be a collaboration and a between you and your child. And so, it sounds like there's so many different ways to do that can work for parents. And that, what you just described, I mean, some sort of, if there was a whole parent sleep training method, it's somewhere between, right? Like graduated extinction and the building that confidence. Cause I know for me, the only way that I could feel in power as a dad, this is pretty vulnerable, but the only way that I could feel in power as a dad, like my wife, she just pulls out the boob and that kid's gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I had the yoga ball and the Moby wrap and I felt like a superhero. Cause my dad, I could just snap, and all my friends who are dads, they're like, I can't do this. My wife has to put him to sleep. I'm like, no, I can do it because I have these tools. But then those tools become dependencies. And then what do? So I feel like that's such a good way to say, empower yourself and then also be willing to adjust slowly in line with your own values and kind of mental health.
And this is why, for me, when it comes to sleep evaluations in my clinic, this is why the evaluations take me an hour. They take me longer than my epilepsy evaluations, because there's so many things to talk about and unpack to make sure that you're doing things in line with what parents desire, what their cultural norms might be, and taking into account all the different factors that will, two caregivers having completely different opinions regarding the approach, et cetera. And so all that can be very challenging. And sleep is a flashpoint. It's a time where everybody's tired, everybody, and everybody, sometimes parents have different approaches to what's going to work best. And so, yes, come up with a cohesive plan, be consistent, and know that there are options, regardless of your parenting style and your preferences. There are options to help with sleep.
Yeah. Dr. Sujay, this has been super, super informative. I want you, I know that, I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but I want you to create a PDF of some kind, if you don't have it, or maybe you have it, I just don't know, of the 4 sleep training methods. And you could put them on a scale of I don't know maybe there should be a box so that people don't feel like they're one thing or another thing, but it just sounds like you have sleep training methods really that could work for any parent. And even the ones that maybe wouldn't work for a parent can be adapted to work for a parent.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I've done that. Well, I wrote I wrote a 50-page book that was like to the point, step by step for every sleep training method. And I tried actually very often, I'll just give it away for free through Amazon because they let me do that every so often. So certainly be on the lookout for that. And you don't need the book because I essentially go through each of these methods on my social media platform. So I have videos dedicated like each of the various sleep training methods, and it's step-by-step instructions with screenshots you can take that have it all written out. And so you may have to dig a little bit. On TikTok, it's on the playlist. So I have toddler playlist for toddler issues and one for all the sleep training approaches. So check those out.
Yeah, check them out. And I'll link the book in the show notes so that people can pick that up. You said it's on Amazon. People can pick that up.
It's on Amazon. Yeah. My child won't sleep. Yeah.
My child won't sleep. All right. With Dr. Sujay, who has been so helpful for us today on the Whole Parent Podcast. How can people connect with you? You mentioned your social media. What's your handle? How can people get great sleep, evidence-based, but also whole parent approved sleep advice from you?
It's that sleep doc is the handle anywhere on any platform, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. That sleep doc everywhere. And I try to make content that's science-based, that's easily applied, and it's practical, give you all some options and some choices.
Science-based, practical sleep training. And for those crazy people among us who cannot bear to let our kids cry for any period of time, you have something for us too. We're not going to be left out in the cold. All right.
Something for everybody. Yeah.
There is something for everyone. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And yeah, any last tip, one tip to give us as we go, or one affirmation or something like that?
Yes. I love to say that we're all in the search for finding the perfect way to parent, like that one right approach to parenting. And I always like to tell people there are a million right ways to parent. There are a million, as long as you're keeping your child safe and you're loving your child, there are a million right ways to do it. So don't feel this pressure that I have to find that one right way to help them sleep or that one right way to make them eat. There are a million right ways to do it. And all those ways are okay because your child is going to thrive and be totally fine.
All right. If you're listening to this before bed, it's time to turn it off so you can get the most possible sleep. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Sujay. And we'll make sure to catch up with you on social media wherever you are. Hey, thank you guys so much for listening to the Whole Parent Podcast today. I hope that you had some of the questions that you have around pediatric sleep answered. As I said at the very beginning of this episode, I am back to remind you that if you have somebody in your life with whom you could share this episode, maybe it's a friend of yours who's been talking about how they've really been struggling to sleep. Maybe it's a person in your life who's pregnant or who's expecting a child, whether that's their first child or not. And you might send them this episode and say, hey, you know what? Right in the middle of this episode, they talk about newborn sleep, and I think that would be really, really beneficial to you. Whomever it is. Maybe it's your parents. You want to send your parents this episode so that they stop badgering you about sleep training or not sleep training, whatever it is. Find somebody to send this episode to and share it. That is second to rating and reviewing it. That is the best way that we can spread this message. And as always, I don't say this on most of my podcasts, but as always, if you are looking for me on social media, if you haven't found me on social media yet, I am at Whole Parent on all of the social media platforms. You can join me there. You can subscribe to my email list. It's the link that is in the show description here below. You can get on that email list, and that's where I put out my most valuable content, including when I let you know when new podcast episodes are upcoming or have already dropped. So if you're not on the email list yet, please go and do that. If you're not following me on the social medias yet, please go and do that. And I just really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. Take care.